All right. We are going to get started here in just a moment. I want to thank everyone for joining us here for our second webinar on the EU forced labor regulation. We have recently seen the updated forced labor regulation guidance that's been published by the Commission. It was published on June 26th in addition to the publication of the forced labor single portal. We're going to review that today and review what has changed from the original drafts that were circulating in Brussels. This is what we covered in our last EUFLR webinar several weeks back. And really how to prepare for the forced labor regulation before December 2027. So I want to welcome everyone today, this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, and looking forward to diving in.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Just as a means of a disclaimer, we always run out of time on these, so I'll jump in. Sourcemap is a solution provider for supply chain due diligence writ large. We specialize in end-tier mapping. We're primarily a software company, and we provide services that have to do with assisting companies in complying with the EU FLR as well as US forced labor regulation and a number of other due diligence requirements like the EU deforestation regulation. We're not an advisor. We're not a legal firm. We don't provide legal services. So this webinar is entirely provided for informative reasons. You should always consult with legal counsel before you determine how these laws apply to you and whether your mitigation strategies are sufficient. And of course, we are happy to answer any questions in the Q&A over the course of this, and there are usually very many of those. But you should always review and make any decisions with your trade compliance specialists and legal specialists.
Excellent. To that end, as Leo said, we are happy to answer any questions that you have throughout this webinar. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen for folks who are new to our webinar format. Please feel free to use that Q&A function throughout the webinar. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can towards the latter half of this session. You're welcome to submit questions anonymously or with your name attached. And again, we'll get to as many as we can. If there are any that we don't have a chance to get to, we will try our best to follow up with you after the webinar has concluded. So for folks who are new here or who are new to the EU forced labor regulation, we're going to do a very, very brief refresher. We're just going to spend 2 minutes on this. I would assume for the most part, folks are pretty familiar with the EU forced labor regulation, but for anyone who is relatively new, the EU forced labor regulation is an outright ban on any products made whole or in part with forced labor from the EU market, regardless of where they've originated from. So that whole or in part language is included in the adopted text. This means that even the smallest component of a product that is associated with forced labor means that the entirety of the product is considered to be made with forced labor. And the EUFLR does not target specific regions of the world. Regardless of where the product originates from, the EUFLR bans that product if it's associated with forced labor from the EU market. So this is a important component of the adopted text. Another really important element that differentiates it from the US forced labor ban, which is the predecessor to the EUFLR and something that the Commission used as sort of a reference point in the drafting of the EUFLR. It is not a product import ban. That means that the EUFLR will not be enforced via shipment detentions at customs in the way that the US forced labor ban is enforced. It will be enforced via investigations by both the Commission and competent authorities within the member state. So this is a distinct difference between the EUFLR and the US forced labor ban and withhold release orders that are executed on the US side. Another really important element of the EUFLR, which we want to spend a couple of minutes talking about here, is it does very explicitly require full supply chain mapping to the farm, to the mine, to the point of origin for the raw materials for the product, as well as complete chain of custody and supporting evidentiary documentation to respond to investigators. So again, we'll expand on this in a moment here, but essentially, if your product is under investigation by competent authorities, they really have carte blanche to ask you for really any evidentiary documentation to prove that that product was not made with forced labor. So, the types of evidence that can be used to as proof there include things like chain of custody to really track, that product's journey from its point of origin to finished goods. So we want to take a moment there to just talk about what that's looked like on the U.S. side as shipments have been detained and companies have responded to customs authorities, and sort of how those learnings can be adopted for investigations on the EU side. I'll kick that over to Leo here for just a moment.
Thanks, Marissa. With the new updated guidance, we're still maintaining the position that the evidence package for the EUFLR looks a lot like the evidence package required by US Customs and Border Protection under the various US forced labor bans. This has come together over the last 5 years as an admissibility package and actually a portal that is used to communicate this information. So they really the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, after having to enforce many hundreds of detentions, they have put together a portal that is now required to be used by companies that face a detention under the forced labor bans, so that they upload the evidence in a structured way, so that it's complete and so that it's accurate. And so we're using that because, in a way, they've really benefited from years of free-form data collection on what is good enough traceability, and they've essentially published a standard. Now, there's a lot of room within the admissibility package because companies have such different supply chains and play such different roles in the supply chain. So first and foremost, even though the admissibility package is formalized, there is a very important narrative component to reporting on an end-to-end supply chain. And by narrative, I mean usually an entire section of the response to Customs and Border Protection is a written explanation of the supply chain diagrams. Usually we refer to supply chain maps, the geographic kind of maps, and also network diagrams that clearly show the flow of materials and semi-finished goods from stage to stage. So we, I guess, wrapping around all of this is a narrative that your companies will have to develop that can be more or less reused from one supply chain to another, but to explain the role you play and some of the more let's say technical details about what your company does to ensure that you actually know where products are coming from, that you're not taking the information from your supply chain at face value. So there's an element of checks and balances, be that volume reconciliation, be those forensic tests, audits, certifications, and the like. Okay, so there's a lot of depth to how, say, a pharmaceutical supply chain can have ensured traceability versus a retail supply chain versus a much more high-tech product supply chain, and they're going to be completely different kinds of responses. Now, that being said, there is a formalized process whereby companies receive a notice. They have to have a team that is pre-assigned to dealing with issues involving forced labor in the supply chain. Oftentimes, that involves procurement because they're the holders of the data about the supply chain and the traceability of goods. Oftentimes, it involves legal. and customs brokerage brokers, but that's in the case of CBP. In the case of the EU, this could happen much before it reaches customs and have nothing to do with customs brokers. There is a pile of documents that needs to be assembled. It should have been pre-assembled, or you should have obtained evidence from your suppliers that they could provide these documents within hours or days, certainly not weeks or months. And those would be the typical commercial documents that you would need to provide chain of custody. So orders, payment receipts, contracts, production records, and even evidence of production capacity of various sites in the supply chain to ensure that the volumes are reasonable for the production. And this is especially important in agricultural supply chain. Um, so this combination of having a ready team, having a ready supplier base, having ready access to commercial documents. By the way, these documents are not available through any third party. These are documents that need to be provided by your suppliers. And then the ability to compile all of that into a narrative structure that can be understood by regulators that may or may not understand your industry or supply chains in general. And so you're educating them about your company, about your industry, and then also sometimes about traceability and supply chains in general. And then, of course, other quantitative evidence like forensic testing, volume reconciliation testing, fraud, waste, abuse, adulteration, detection, all of those checks and balances that are being run on your supply chain. Those are also looked at very carefully. Um, and then that's it. That's the admissibility package that you need for CBP. As you probably know, US CBP is also asking all of its trading partners to have forced labor bans in place where there's a certain symmetry. And this is also all of the data that you would need to do traceability demonstrations. For example, if you were under investigation for the EU deforestation regulation. So we know that this is really pretty standard. It hasn't been formalized by the EU, but we expect it will look a lot like this once it does. Back to you, Marissa.
Great. Another really important element of the EUFLR is the expectation that operators conduct end-to-end due diligence in advance. So not just after an investigation has been initiated. This is something that is clearly articulated in the guidance. However, the guidance that has been published here is exactly that. It is guidance. It is not intended to be prescriptive. And if you read the guidance closely, there is room for interpretation here where, it is dependent on a company's resources, a company's operations, and a company's business in terms of how they actually conduct their due diligence processes. There isn't a, 20-step checklist included in this guidance that says these are exactly the steps that a company needs to take in order to check every single box here in terms of, the commission's expectation and the member states' expectation of their forced labor due diligence processes. However, there is an expectation that operators are conducting this due diligence in advance and not just waiting until a investigation is initiated and then scrambling to conduct due diligence after the fact. First of all, that would be entirely too late. We'll talk about that in a subsequent slide because there is one thing that this guidance did clarify is some of the timelines around the amount of time that operators would have to respond to investigators. There just is not enough time if you wait until an investigation has actually been initiated to just begin a due diligence process for the first time into your products. But also, the spirit of this law is to prevent products associated with forced labor from entering the EU market. That requires due diligence in advance because competent authorities would not be able to investigate every single product that is entering the EU market. So there is an expectation and a requirement, not just an expectation, that operators are conducting this due diligence in advance of any investigation. Another really important element here is the public aspect of the forced labor single portal. Unlike the US forced labor ban, the results of EUFLR investigations will be made public via the forced labor single portal. These are just the results of investigations where forced labor has been found to be associated with products. So, investigations where a product is found to not be associated with forced labor, those investigations would not be public on the single portal. But any product that is associated with forced labor, that information would be available to the public via the single portal. That is a extremely different aspect of the EUFLR compared to the US forced labor ban. None of that information around detentions and seizures of shipments is public or made public by US Customs and Border Protection. There's obviously press that can come out around companies that have been impacted by seizures and detentions by CBP, but that is not specifically publicized, excuse me, by CBP. And then finally, when we refer to competent authorities, we are referring to both competent authorities within the 27 member states as well as the European Commission by themselves. So the Commission will investigate all forced labor claims that are made outside of the European Union. We can imagine that that will be the majority of forced labor claims. The competent authorities within the member states would investigate all claims that are made within the member states. We can go to the slide after this. Oh, excuse me. Let's go to the slide 5, sorry. Sorry, 5, Leo, the EUFLR update. So we're going to talk about what the June guidelines clarify. These guidelines, this is the finalized version of the guidelines. So in our first webinar that we discussed with many of you who are returning here, these guidelines were first circulated, a draft version of these guidelines were circulated amongst the member states a couple of months back now for comment, for feedback, and for opportunity for potential changes. So there have been some changes made to the original draft. There's also been quite a bit of additional detail added from those drafts that were circulated now that these guidelines have been finalized. So these are really the key takeaways from this finalized version. The first is that the guidelines expect the OECD six-step due diligence framework to be the first step to really help companies identify and address human rights in their operations and supply chains. These allow companies to really tailor their approach to their respective sectors and supply chains and regional contexts. A really important element here that I just want to drill down into is just as I mentioned that the guidelines are not prescriptive here, the OECD six-step due diligence framework is also not particularly prescriptive. This is a six-step framework. There is room for interpretation here in terms of how a company is actually interpreting these guidelines for their respective business. Again, it's not a list of very specific steps that a company can take. We're going to go to the next slide here and just quickly show you what the OECD six-step due diligence framework looks like. If you go to the forced labor regulation single portal, you can download the official guidelines, and the OECD six-step due diligence framework is included in the guidelines. So just as an aside, if you haven't had a chance to actually review the official guidelines, all of this information is included there as well. So I would encourage you to look at this. But the OECD six-step due diligence framework is as follows. First, Embed responsible business conduct into policies and management systems. So this is expected not just for operators themselves, but also for their suppliers, their upstream suppliers. If you think about this in the context of the EUFLR and that whole or in part language for EUFLR, again, any element of a product that is found to be associated with forced labor taints the entire product. So if your supplier is engaged in forced labor, the entire product is associated with forced labor. So that business conduct, the responsible business conduct policies cannot just be at the operator level. They have to be associated with the entirety of the supply chain. Step two is identify and assess actual and potential adverse impacts. I mean, this goes without saying, this is a pretty broad step. This can look very different depending on the resources that an operator has. But the expectation here is to implement a risk-based approach. That is the commission's assumption here, is that operators would implement a risk-based approach. Step three is to seize, prevent, and mitigate adverse impacts. Put a pin in this. We're going to come back to this in terms of how the commission is expecting operators to associate this with the EUFLR, because there are some really important caveats to operators' ability to mitigate forced labor when we're talking about EUFLR, and really just how realistic it is to mitigate forced labor once it has been identified. Step four is track implementation and results of the steps that you have taken. That's sort of the entirety of that. Step five is communicate actions and impacts across the supply chain and across the business. And step six is provide for or cooperate in remediation. The expectation here is greater the larger the company is, and sort of the greater the resources the company is, because again, the larger a company is, and the greater that the impact that they have on the supply chain, the more that they can potentially impact change with their upstream suppliers. So we're going to kick back to slide 5 and talk about the rest of the June guidelines. Another element that the guidelines clarify is the Commission will allow due diligence conducted under overlapping EU regulations. For example, the corporate due diligence regulation, due diligence directive, excuse me, to count towards evidence in investigations. Very important here to be mindful of implementation timelines, because not every single regulation or directive will be in effect by the time of EUFLR. This does not mean that just because due diligence has been conducted for another EU regulation that you are entirely covered for EUFLR. But this is something that is noted in the guidelines. There are other EU regulations and directives that have a social and human rights due diligence element. So there are some overlapping due diligence requirements for some of these regulations. If due diligence has already been conducted for some of these regulations, and evidentiary documentation has been conducted, codes of conduct have been conducted or collected, operators are allowed to demonstrate what due diligence they have already conducted for these overlapping regulations and directives. But again, you must be mindful of the implementation timelines for these regulations. You could not use, for example, if an investigation is conducted in January of 2028, and you are referring to due diligence that you intend to conduct for a regulation that has not actually gone into effect yet, that would not suffice in terms of, referring to due diligence that, your company has not actually undergone. So Definitely be mindful of implementation timelines because, of course, all of these EU regulations and directives do not go into effect at the same time, and many of them have sort of cascading implementation. Next, credible claims of imposed forced labor will be prioritized by competent authorities. So this is emphasized multiple times throughout the guidelines. Sort of what are the types of forced labor that competent authorities will consider the most severe, and sort of what are the ways in which competent authorities will prioritize the claims of forced labor that they receive. One can assume that quite a great deal of claims of forced labor will be coming in via this single portal. Competent authorities will not be able to investigate every single one of these claims. And as we've talked about, the commission is responsible for investigating every claim of forced labor that is made outside of the EU, which would inevitably be the majority of these claims. So they will be overburdened here in terms of the amount of claims that they will be investigating, that the commission will be investigating compared to competent authorities within the member states. So they will need to prioritize. They can't investigate every single claim. They just will not have the resources to do so. State imposed forced labor will really go to the top of the queue. Um, Next, risk-based priorities were more clearly defined. This is related to this bullet that I just walked through. Risk-based priorities were much more clearly defined for competent authorities. The scale and severity, the state-imposed forced labor risk was ranked the highest, as I just described. The EU market volume and value of the product would also factor in to that criteria for prioritization. And then the significance of the tainted input in the final product. So I do want to talk about this in a little bit more detail here. So Leah, if you wouldn't mind skipping forward to slide 7. I want to talk about what is specifically in the guidance here around how competent authorities will prioritize credible claims of forced labor. So the information on this slide comes directly from the guidance. First, the guidance talks about this risk-based approach for prioritizing and targeting investigations. These are the steps, the criteria that is identified in the guidance. First, competent authorities are supposed to look at the scale and severity of suspected forced labor. As I mentioned, state-imposed forced labor would be prioritized. That really jumps to the top of the queue. When we're talking about types of forced labor, the Commission, or excuse me, the EU is looking at the ILO definitions of forced labor, which again, they're defined in the guidance, but you can also look these up. The ILO has these very clearly defined. So they are first supposed to look at the scale and severity of the forced labor in terms of their criteria for prioritization. Next, they're supposed to look at the quantity or volume of products that are made available or placed or made available on the EU market. So what does that suggest? That suggests that larger companies with a global reach would be prioritized for investigation. Products that are companies that are able to place a larger volume of products on the EU market have a much higher chance of being investigated under the EUFLR if claims are made that their products are suspected of being associated with forced labor. Next, the share of the part of the product suspected to have been made with forced labor in the final product. So again, that whole or in part language is really important in the adopted text. But as competent authorities and the Commission are identifying which claims to prioritize, they are also supposed to look at, how much of the product is associated or is expected to be associated with forced labor, whether it is just a really small component of the product or a large component of the product. This certainly does not suggest that if there's a claim that just a small component of a product is associated with forced labor, that those claims would not be investigated. That is actually something that is noted in the guidance that, even a small claim could still absolutely be investigated. But, as competent authorities are prioritizing, this is something that they are supposed to be factoring in. Next, competent authorities are also supposed to look at criteria to identify economic operators for the investigative phase. So, what does this mean? There are a lot of operators, a lot of entities in a supply chain. Competent authorities are supposed to look at which operators, which companies should they be focused on as they are investigating these specific products. So, really, which companies bear the brunt of the responsibility for the issue of forced labor in the supply chain. And really, when we look at the criteria that's identified here in the guidance, they are really looking at, this suggests that they are really looking at the largest companies and the companies that have the greatest amount of leverage and power to have the greatest amount of responsibility here. So first, they're looking at the proximity to the alleged forced labor, as well as the highest leverage to prevent, mitigate, and bring an end to the forced labor in question. So who in the supply chain can affect change in the operations or practices of other entities in that supply chain? Those are usually the largest companies in the supply chain. Again, the companies towards the end of the supply chain that have the greatest power to enact that change further upstream. The size and economic resources of economic operators in the supply chain, so those operators that have the greater amount of resources and of a larger size would be the ones that investigators are prioritizing. And then the complexity of the supply chain. I did pull a quote here from the guidance. Greater supply chain complexity generally reduces transparency, accountability, and traceability of forced labor risks. So I did want to just pause here for a quick moment. This quote is interesting because this doesn't always mean that the largest companies have the most complex supply chains. Sometimes large companies have fairly simple supply chains. Sometimes small companies have incredibly complex supply chains. This is something that, the commission has included in here, suggesting that, the most complex supply chains tend to be more opaque, which, tends to be true when there are additional steps or a large amount of steps in a supply chain. There's a greater likelihood that operators, there may be steps within a supply chain where operators are unaware of every single step. But this is included in here to suggest that investigators should factor in how complex the supply chain is when they are prioritizing, which operators to include in the investigative phase of the EUFLR. So I wanted to pause here, Leo, and see if there was anything you wanted to add here about sort of what we've seen in some of the investigations that we've participated in on the US side, any learnings that we've had that maybe we could share with some of our audience that may be applicable to EUFLR.
Yeah, thanks, Marissa. And then we'll get to, I think we have a few questions in the Q&A just after this slide. We've been part of a pretty large number of investigations, detentions, and just general fact-finding projects on behalf of US Customs, which has been enforcing forced labor ban for the longest, and then more recently conversations around in competent authorities and with competent authorities in Europe for this and other regulations. Obviously, we can't speak to anything in specifics, but it's clear that reputational damage is one of the biggest levers, and it is one that they almost explicitly seem to be to be going for, the combination of the portal, the whistleblower component, and this discussion of scale. Just as an aside, the U.S. forced labor ban does not have any weight on how big a company is, how much of its supply chain is touched by forced labor, or how many of its products are affected. Frankly, anyone involved in the chain, even somebody who is involved in the transportation part of the supply chain, taints the entire supply chain. So that's a much more absolute qualification, more similar to the EU deforestation regulation, where any farm with deforestation blocks the entire shipment, no matter how many farms are contributing to that shipment. So, this means that they, more than any other due diligence regulation, they're explicitly targeting multinationals. And in our conversations, we've certainly seen there is an assumption that large companies have less visibility in their supply chain. I think that assumption is completely wrong. We have achieved the best visibility in supply chains where there is significant leverage and larger buyers. But be that as it may, the regulators are going to be scrutinizing larger companies, larger shares of forced labor, and state-owned forced labor, which means, I think we all know what that means. Um, that being said, uh, they are not operating from a place of having a lot of information about supply chains. We saw this with CBP in the US, where they started to use a lot of AI-based search engines that essentially scoured open source data to draw any potential link between a company and uh, a supplier known to have used forced labor. Those databases, those tools are extremely inaccurate, and they are largely false positives because they don't have any access to the commercial data about the supply chain, the transactions, the orders, the shipping receipts, the contracts between companies. None of those exist in the public domain. None of those are scrutinized by these tools. And so as a result, it really behooves companies to do two things: to map their whole supply chain as early as possible to determine whether there are any black holes, any parts of the supply chain that they cannot map. That's the biggest risk, you know, uh, overall, is any part of the supply chain where they cannot get visibility, that they have to assume there's forced labor there. And that mapping is relatively quick. It only takes a few weeks or maybe 2 months, and it immediately surfaces the places in which you cannot do business if you want to import into the US or the EU, and now a growing list of other countries. The second thing is to really have commercial document collection enabled. And I don't mean that every company should collect every PO for every shipment, but to have conducted a process audit, what we call a mock investigation at Sourcemap. But you've made sure that all your suppliers could provide you with transaction documents to substantiate the origin of a shipment upon request, and in a timely way, and in a way that is accurate and complete. It's too many documents to be collecting them proactively for every shipment. But if you find suppliers that cannot produce those kinds of documents, and I mean receipts that trace the product all the way back to the raw material, then you have to start working with them on capacity building to put those traceability systems in place to be able to provide that data. It's just like a recall. You don't have to store all the information for a recall, but your suppliers are required contractually to provide it within a certain amount of time. And I would recommend, 72 hours in this case. And with those documents that you need to be able to collect, you'll know a lot more than the authorities. And in our cases, our customers were always able to provide evidence, either a bill of materials, specific orders, and specific contracts to say, hey, this linkage is obsolete. There was a link 5 years ago. The tools they're using, the tools that investigative journalists are using, the tools that NGOs are using, activists, they're not able to say that that supplier was your supplier at that time. They're only able to point to a potential event at some point in the past. So when the transaction happened, the exact nature of the transaction, the specific color, material, component, again, these are databases and relationships that look at broad commercial relationships, but they don't know whether that supplier could have been part of your supply chain, whether you even buy the products or processes that that supplier provides. So specificity, using commercial documents, the ability to compile those documents on demand, those have been really a saving grace for our customers who have been involved in detentions and investigations and in these general fact findings. And then the ability to provide all that information in a readily digestible way for non-experts is surprising, is surprised me, but that was very important to have a narrative, to have a visualization, and to be able to point to it. Now, don't get me wrong. We've also seen the other side of the coin. We've seen companies that couldn't get the right documentation together, and we've seen companies where the documentation was, upon review, clearly fraudulent or clearly indicated third country. There's been a pass through in the supply chain to disguise the origin of products, and again, those are much better surprises to have before an investigation than after. So that's why we always recommend map, make sure you don't have any black holes, and then conduct a process audit of the traceability and make sure that the documents are accurate and they pass a validation step. I'll turn it back to you, but I think, Marissa, there's a few questions that are really on the mechanics of the regulation, the categories, the dates. I assume you already looked at those. Is there any that
Yes,
you want to take on
some of
now?
those
Yeah.
we're actually going to cover in the next slide. So I'm going
Okay.
to hold on answering those. Let's actually go quickly back to slide 5. There's just a couple things I want to cover before we get to these questions. So one really important element that's included in the guidance here related to the state-imposed forced labor question is around remediation. Operators are encouraged to mitigate forced labor risks wherever possible, but the guidance does call out the fact that, state-imposed forced labor cannot be independently remediated. If an operator becomes aware of the fact that they are sourcing from an area where a supplier is or a factory is in an area where state-imposed forced labor is an issue. Steps may need to be taken outside of, remediation of forced labor in that factory. There's only so much you can do when there is an issue of state-imposed forced labor. So there is sort of an acknowledgement in the guidance of the limitations of remediation at the operator level when we're talking about an issue as severe as state-imposed forced labor. And even when we're talking about remediation for a forced labor issue that's not as broad reaching as state-imposed forced labor, I will just say, when we're looking at remediation, um, uh, for forced labor issues outside of state-imposed, for example, you may see that your supplier is unable to provide you with or has not provided you with sufficient evidentiary documentation for a particular element of your due diligence process, and you go back to that supplier and ask them to rectify that issue and provide that evidence. They're able to, come back and provide that evidence and meet that standard that you as an operator have set. That might qualify to your business as, remediating the problem of that you originally identified of not meeting your due diligence burden or obligation. But once you actually have identified issues of forced labor in your supply chain, there is a limitation to how much remediation you actually are able to do, because you do have to factor in the issue of potential fraudulent evidence. And again, as I've said, and as the guidance articulates here, the issue of state-imposed forced labor is a much more difficult issue to remediate than an operator is capable of doing. So this is something that the guidance does very clearly call out. Another element that I do want to talk about is the deadlines for disposal of products. This is something that's defined in the guidance. I don't believe we talked about this earlier in the webinar, but after a decision is made, operators must dispose of or withdraw goods found to be made with forced labor from the EU market. This would be at the operator's expense. So this is potentially quite a large expense for the operator because if we're thinking about every product, every single unit of a product that is already on the EU market, if it is found to be associated with forced labor, this now needs to be disposed of, withdrawn from the EU market. The operator foots the bill for that disposal. If it is a perishable good, it would need to be disposed of in as few as 10 working days. If it is a non-perishable good, it would need to be disposed of in 30 working days. Finally, the methodology for financial penalties was established in the guidance. This is the financial penalty that is imposed if, after a decision is made, an operator fails to meet the requirement to dispose of and withdraw a good or in the timeline that has been established, the timeline that we just talked about. They have now not met the requirements of the law. They are now subject to the financial penalty at the discretion of the member states or the commission. So the financial penalties, the methodology for the financial penalties are intended to be something that the member states can determine, but they have to factor in the gravity of the issue. So, how many, essentially the volume of the products that are still on the EU market, the duration of the non-compliance issue, any mitigating factors. The member states have to notify the EU of their respective penalty rules by December 14th of this year. So, relatively soon. I will pause here and open this up. I know we have a couple of questions here that I want to answer. So I see a question here around are there any updates of when the database will become live? So couple of things I want to talk about here. There are some additional resources. I don't know if we want to skip forward to slide 8 or slide 9, actually. There are some additional data resources on the single portal that are not yet available. For folks who are not aware, the single portal is not just for downloading the EUFLR guidance. The single portal actually will have a lot of helpful resources included. Not all of these are available yet. The database will be the risk database, I should say, which is what this question is referring to, will be available before the regulation goes into effect. So the timeline has not been made clear yet or has not been announced yet. They essentially have until December 2027 to actually publish all of the information here in this risk assessment database. But we do know that they're actively working on this now, so I do anticipate that they will publish this well before December 2027, but they do have until December 2027. So they don't necessarily need to publish this, in the next few weeks. They have quite a bit of time to do this. But the intent of this database for folks, if you want to go to the next slide, Leo, the intent of this database is to help operators identify forced labor risks with their respective products. There's a related question here around whether the EU will target specific products. So while the EUFLR does not focus, it's not intended to focus on specific products. Because the risk database will have information on certain products that have been found to have a higher risk of being associated with forced labor, logic suggests that those would be products that if you are an operator working with those products or commodities, those may be products that investigators may be looking at more closely because if resources are being compiled by competent authorities, by the commission, around, why these products have a higher risk of being associated with forced labor. I mean, the suggestion there is that those may be products that the commission may be focusing on, even though the EUFLR is technically banning all products from the EU market that may be associated with forced labor. So that does answer this other question here around whether there are certain categories that would be prioritized. So this database will be published at some point before December of 2027. The forced labor single portal will also be the area where if you have a credible claim of forced labor, this is where you would submit this information. This screenshot is on the next slide. This part of the website would not be available until December 14th, 2027, because of course, this can't be live until the EUFLR is actually in effect. This is the submission point for credible claims of forced labor. This is the secure online channel by which these claims can be submitted. So again, this is really the one-stop shop for everything for EUFLR. This is also where public information around investigations that have found products to be associated with forced labor, this is where that information would live. And then finally, before we open it up to additional questions here, I did want to share, in case anyone has not seen this, there are a lot of free resources and webinars that the Commission has opened registration for these virtual implementation sessions for specific sectors. Starting in December, they run from about mid-September to end of November. These are implementation sessions for EUFLR. These are all free and open, and registration is open for all of these. These are to help operators prepare for EUFLR. I would encourage you all to register for these implementation sessions, depending on which sector is and which event is most relevant to you. But these can be found on the single portal. I'd encourage you to look out for these. And Leo, I will kick it over to you to wrap things up, and then I think we can open it up to a couple more questions here before we close things out.
Yeah, and I think I'll address the multiple questions that are coming in, also about regulations that seem to prevent the sharing of data relating to EUFLR. It's always been a very uneasy space for really since we began doing this. There have always been regulations, including in Europe and in North America, that prevent companies from complying with laws imposed by other countries that are seen as being discriminatory against a specific country. And business, trade, and the exchange of information has continued unfettered throughout. The recent pronouncements by China, I think it's specifically 834, 835, they actually very similar to the prior stance that was officially stated. And honestly, it's also the position of Sourcemap. Supply chain mapping has nothing to do with forced labor. It's a business process that companies need to undertake to first and foremost, qualify their suppliers and ensure that their suppliers are able to provide, the right goods, the right quality, the right time, and in a dependable way. So it's first and foremost, it's a resilience issue, because suppliers that won't tell you where their products come from cannot be counted on in a crunch. It's secondarily, it's a quality, an anti-counterfeiting, anti-adulteration measure. Again, if you don't know where your goods are flowing through, there's any number of bad actors that could do damage to the product on its way to market. And you need to know where the products come from to make sure that the products you're buying are actually what you think they are. So supply chain mapping and then traceability, which is collecting documents to provide evidence of that supply chain mapping. Those are business processes that are core to running a company that has a global supply chain, and they should be treated as such. None of the data that Sourcemap is collecting is specific to forced labor. When we're talking about mapping, we're talking about traceability, we're talking about a business process that is primarily concerned with ensuring that there's visibility over the supply chain so that companies can know that that supply chain will continue to provide goods. So it's a primarily operational concern. None of the data collection requests are singling out any country. None of the data collection requests are singling out any issue, including forced labor, because they're not about that. They're about establishing the integrity of the supply chain, and that's how it should be treated. Um, with that, careful consideration in mind, it has never been a problem to collect accurate and complete supply chain mapping data from any country. Um, some countries are easier than others, but certainly China is not one of the harder ones to get transparency from. So I think companies should continue, but should do this, very holistically, globally, and for operational reasons. And then the benefits of those operational data collections is on this screen, you can see there's basically any number of regulations that you also get to then use that data for if you should need to. And this is not a proactive reporting statute like the EUDR. This is in response to an investigation. So companies should map, they should trace, and they should keep that data in case there's an investigation, independent of any specific regulation. And that has been the best positioning in our experience to make sure that it continues to happen without raising any flags globally.
Great. There's two other questions I just wanted to address before we wrap here. There's one great question here. If an SME is supplying multiple brands with the same product, would all brands be investigated separately, or will it come down to the quantity of products placed on the market by brand? So this is a great question. Based on how the guidance is written, investigators are supposed to, factor in to their determination of sort of which operators to investigate, um, the quantity of the products, the size of the operator, and sort of, which operator or operators, plural, have the most leverage to impact change in the supply chain. Again, this suggests that not just a single operator can be investigated in one investigation. I do want to make that clear. There's nothing in the guidance that suggests that one product means one operator. That is not articulated in the guidance. And also, if a product is associated with forced labor and is banned from the EU market, it is banned from the EU market. So any brand associated with that product would be impacted by that ban. So, an investigation could easily involve multiple brands, and the product ban would involve multiple brands. Now, which particular operator is then on the hook for withdrawing that product from the EU market? I think that would come to, the investigator's determination of which operator has placed the largest amount of that product on the EU market. We don't necessarily know based on how the guidance is written whether they would share that responsibility. That is unclear. I can think of many examples where this question applies, where, there's a product where there are numerous brands that might be impacted by a single product ban. But if a product is banned, numerous brands could easily be impacted and impacted by an investigation. So that's a great question. And then the final question I just wanted to address was the question of who can submit a claim. So really anyone can submit a claim. A factory worker can submit a claim. There are protections. An NGO can submit a claim. Sorry to finish out that thought. There are protections on the forced labor single portal around the fact that the claims are anonymous. But the claims also have to be credible. So, investigators are not going to look into every claim that's just, any person just saying, hey, look into this brand. I don't like this brand. The claims have to be credible. They have to have some form of evidence attached, and they have to be valid and real claims. So they are protected in terms of anonymizing the folks who are submitting the claims. But there is quite a bit of openness in terms of who can submit those claims. They could easily be workers at factories who have firsthand knowledge to the claims that they are submitting. So we do want to close out here with our contact information for our repeat attendees. You should all have our contact information, but for folks who don't, please feel free to reach out to us. I know there are some questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. We came right up to time here. Thank you all so much for such an engaging conversation today. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, please email us. Please reach out to us. We're happy to answer any questions that we didn't get a chance to cover today. And also, please look out for our next webinar series. We will be hosting additional webinars in the coming weeks. So we will be announcing our next round of webinars coming soon. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you again for joining us this morning. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.